Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jumped over. Yeah, you know that nursery rhyme. You probably had it recited to you when you were a child. You probably have recited it to your own children. But have you ever stopped to wonder what it means? I mean, it's kind of a weird little story, isn't it, about some guy named Jack who jumped over a candlestick, and it was so noteworthy that somebody was inspired to write a nursery rhyme about it. Turns out there is a story behind that little nursery rhyme. Apparently, in the 19th century, candlestick jumping was a thing. Who would have guessed? It was a thing that they sometimes did at weddings. It was intended to predict the future of the wedded couple. If the groom could jump over a candlestick that was lit and the flame stayed lit when he jumped over it, then that meant that there was a rich future and good luck for the couple ahead. But if in the process of jumping over the candlestick, the draft of the wind that he created in the jumping process snuffed out the flame, that was a bad omen for the couple. We recite it like a story that happened. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jumped over the candlestick. It's really poor English grammar, but we ignore that in the telling of that old story. But the verse was actually a wish, words of instruction, words of encouragement. Jack, be nimble. Jack, be quick. Jack, jump over that candlestick. The British tradition originated from an ancient pagan practice of jumping over fires. But apparently British people aren't brave enough to jump over fires, so someone said, well, how about a candlestick instead? And so this practice evolved. It was intended to bring good luck. That practice dates back several centuries before the time of Christ to the ancient Persian culture. It is still practiced by Iranians today, who are the heirs of the Persian ancestry. And they do this leap over fires as a part of their New Year's celebration. Before leaping over the fire, they ask the fire to burn away all of their misfortune, while at the same time granting them good luck for the coming year. Hopefully, they successfully leap over the fire so that it doesn't burn away anything else other than their misfortune. That could be a bad situation. But apparently, many foolhardy young American males have also adopted that tradition. Although I suspect that it's more influenced by alcohol than it is by a wish for good luck. And they don't appear too nimble in the process of leaping over fire according to several videos I have seen, like this one. Yow. Didn't go as he planned. I don't know about the prospects for that guy's future, but his immediate present was one of pretty bad luck. This morning, we're going to examine something that happened at a fire. It involved the Apostle Peter. It's a story of his failure, but also a story of God's grace under fire. That phrase, under fire, is familiar to us. It originally described a troop, an army troop that was assailed by small arms attack or maybe an artillery attack. They were said to be under fire. But in a figurative way, that term has come to describe someone who is under severe attack of verbal criticism. It therefore describes a time of stress and anxiety. Twice in the Bible, we find the Apostle Peter standing at a fire. Both times were extremely stressful for him. When he was under fire, we see God's grace granted to him. And from his story, we are assured that God will grant us grace even when we fail under fire. Peter's first experience was standing at the fire of failure. We're going to read that in just a moment, but I want to set the background first. The events that we are going to read take place the night that Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was put on trial before the Sanhedrin Council in a very quickly constructed trial. They were bound, determined to find him guilty and crucify him the next day, which they did. But before Jesus left the Last Supper with his disciples, he warned them that he was going to be taken. He said, "When I am taken, all of you will run away. You'll scatter." And Peter said, "Lord, even if all the others run away from you, I never will." And so when that time came, Peter was standing at the fire. He was true to his word. When Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the other apostles all fled, but Peter and John did not. They followed close by, and they stood at a safe distance to watch the trial of Jesus unfold. It's there we find him standing at a fire in John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went in with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stirred around a fire they had made to keep them warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So there he was by the fire. He had already denied Jesus one time. We skip down a few verses and pick up the rest of the story. As Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. We have all failed under pressure. Like Peter, we too have found ourselves under fire and wilted. Do you remember that commitment that Peter made? "Lord, I'll never leave you. I'll never deny you." Luke's account tells us that he made a statement even more bold than that. As we read in Luke 22:33, Peter said, "Lord, I am ready to go to prison with you and even to die with you." That was a bold statement of commitment, and he meant it. But when the heat was turned up, his courage melted. Have you ever made a commitment to God that you couldn't keep? A bold statement of conviction inspired perhaps on Sunday morning, but you'd failed already by Tuesday. You swore off swearing, but took the Lord's name in vain again. You promised to be a promise keeper, but you broke your word. You pledged to temper your temper, only to lose it again. Or maybe in the heat of the moment you reacted poorly, or you said something you wish you could retract, or you made another bad choice, or you gave in to temptation once again. We've all been there. We have all failed. And we all know the heat of shame. Luke's account tells us that when Peter had made that third denial and he heard the rooster crow, something clicked inside of him. Jesus had predicted that very thing. "This night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. When he heard that sound, his mind went back to that statement Jesus made, and he looked over at Jesus only to find Jesus looking straight at him. Their eyes met. Can you imagine how Peter must have felt? I think we can. For we too have felt the flush of shame creep across our face. That burning red feeling on our skin matches how we feel on the inside. Those bitter tears that Peter wept were heated by his humiliation and disgrace. We know that feeling. Psalm 44:15 speaks for all of us when it says, "My disgrace is before me. My shame has covered my face." Where do we turn in our disgrace and shame? To whom do we go, especially if it is God that we have failed? We go to him. And we find the grace that he offers when we fail under fire. That is the most important part of Peter's story. After he was discovered standing at the fire of failure, he was then invited to the fire of forgiveness. Let me set the stage for those verses as well as we're going to look at them. The events that we're going to read in John chapter 21 happened several days after Jesus was crucified. After Peter was standing at that first fire, Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. He had made one appearance to his disciples, but Peter was laying low. Peter was ashamed to meet Jesus face to face. He didn't want to face him in his state of failure, and so he kind of made himself a little invisible. He decided he was going to go back to his old way of life, in fact, and so he went fishing. He took some of the disciples with him. They fished all night. They caught nothing. That morning, as they were rowing back to shore, a lone figure appeared on the beach. And that figure called out and asked them, "Have you caught anything?" "No," they said, "we've toiled all night and caught nothing." That figure then said, "Cast your nets out on the other side of the boat." And they did. And they caught so many fish they couldn't pull them aboard. John recognized that it was Jesus, for he had performed that same miracle before them a few years earlier. Let's pick up the verses then with that background in John 21, verses 7 through 10. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there, with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Jesus extended a gracious invitation, not just to breakfast, but an invitation to grace. It's an invitation all of us need. He invited them to come to him. That invitation to grace of necessity had to include, first of all, an invitation to conviction. We see that in Peter's story. If we skip down a few verses and pick it up in verse 15 of that chapter. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." Next slide, please. A third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." When Peter arrived on shore and he smelled the wood smoke, it was a reminder to him of the previous time he had stood beside a fire. Just a few days earlier, Jesus constructed that scenario on purpose. And when he heard Jesus ask him 3 times, "Do you love me?" one for each time that he had denied Jesus, it reminded him of his denial. Jesus had purposely asked the question that way. Simon Peter was under heavy conviction. He had wept earlier, bitterly, the scriptures tell us, but he was sorry, but Jesus wanted more than remorse. He wanted a conviction that would change Peter's life. Jesus could have slipped his arm around Peter's shoulders and said, I know things have been very difficult for you these last several days. You are confused and afraid and grieving. You're under a lot of stress. I know those words of denial weren't really from your heart. You have been an emotional wreck. You aren't yourself. All is forgiven. But Jesus didn't offer Peter any excuses. He didn't offer him an easy way out. He asked, do you love me? Do you really love me? Are you sure you love me? And it hurt. It was an invitation to grace, but it had to be preceded by this invitation to conviction. That was then followed by an invitation to forgiveness, a graciousness that all of us need. Jesus was saying, I heard what you said. I heard you cursing that you don't know me. And I remember the promise you made to me at the Last Supper. So, Peter, do you still think you love me more than the others do? Jesus made sure that conviction stung so that Peter would never forget how guilty he was, and so that he would never forget what Jesus was about to do. Let's read that in verse 19 of our story. Then he said to him, follow me. Jesus reissued his original call to Peter. It was as if Jesus was saying, Peter, let's start over. Let's put this behind us. I have forgiven everything. I still want you. We don't like conviction. It doesn't feel good. We would prefer to avoid it, but we need it. Max Lucado wrote that his daughter, Andrea, got a splinter in her finger when she was about 5 or 6. So he took her into the bathroom and he got out the needle and the tweezers and the iodine and the Band-Aid. Andrea had been through this before. She remembered the pain of digging a splinter out of her finger. And so when she saw all that material being constructed or gathered together, she said, I just want the Band-Aid, Daddy. Lucado wrote, sometimes we are like that. We go to God with our sin, but we don't want the pain of conviction and guilt. All we want is some kind of covering for our sin. We prefer to skip the treatment. It's too unpleasant. And so we say, let's just put a Band-Aid on this, God. But conviction is good for us. It changes us, and we need that. That's why the Apostle Paul wrote these words in 2 Corinthians 7, verse 10. Godly sorrow makes people change their hearts and lives. This leads to salvation, and you cannot be sorry for that. Grace is the bridge between failure and forgiveness, and repentance is the pathway to that bridge. If you have ever failed under duress, if you have ever melted under fire, Jesus is calling you to the fire of forgiveness. He's calling you to grace. Jesus wants to meet you there, where after your conviction, you are sorry, ready to receive the forgiveness that only a gracious God can offer. And he offers it today. Maybe you have never received that. Maybe you don't know that feeling of having your shame completely washed away, of not having any guilt any longer. Maybe you still are wary of approaching God because of your guilt. Jesus doesn't want you to live like that. He extends this invitation, therefore, to come to him and accept the grace that washes your sin and your guilt away, to become a part of his forgiven people, his forgiven family. If you'd like to accept that gift of God, then we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.